The next step in creating a pattern is that I don't want the tesserae to stick out from the substrate. If you don't want to use stained glass and you'd rather use something else, that's perfectly fine. You can probably skip this pattern making step and move on to the tiling. So I decided on white thin set as the adhesive, and I'll give you a bunch of reasons why in a minute, but let's get started tiling and then we'll circle back to some of the other adhesive options. The project I'm going to show you today, between the glass cutting and the grouting and everything else, can be applied to other Mosaic projects that you work on. So I'm going to mix something into my grout to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit, and that something is, by far, the tracing and cutting of the stained glass took the longest of any of the steps in this project. Let's get to it. Welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Julie. And on this channel, we talk about tips, tricks, tools, adhesives, materials, and specific Mosaic projects, all to shorten your learning curve when it comes to creating Mosaic art. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. I'm calling today's project a winter tree instead of a Christmas tree because, well, it's not a Christmas tree. I was inspired by pictures of forests, and these trees had so many different snowfalls on them, and they're just so beautiful and majestic. We can all enjoy and celebrate what's going on in nature. Now, I live in Miami, Florida, so having something like a winter tree on my coffee table or even my desk in the studio is a great reminder of the season that's coming. Because let's face it, I can't look outside and see beautiful, cool weather and trees that have snow on them. But for those who do celebrate Christmas, but they don't like the over-the-top Christmas decor, today's project is a nice neutral piece that just sort of sets the tone for the season. And keep in mind that what I'll be showing you in today's tutorial, between the tesserae selection and how to create patterns and cut stained glass and the tiling and grouting methods, these can all be applied to various types of tree substrates, which we'll discuss much more in depth later in the video. Oftentimes, many of you ask down in the comments of my videos where you can get the tesserae or the substrates or tools, adhesives, what have you. And I always put that stuff down in the description, which is located below the video. Now you can access this information if you're on your desktop computer by clicking Show More under the video description. And if you're on your tablet or your smartphone, you can click the down arrow to the right of the video title. So in today's video, I'll show you how I turned a store-bought tree substrate into a winter mosaic tree for your coffee table, shelf, or work from home desk. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. 'Tis the season, and at the time of filming this video, we are just on the cusp of entering the wintertime season. So online stores and physical brick and mortar stores are full of these tree substrates. The project I'm going to show you today, between the glass cutting and the grouting and everything else, can be applied to other Mosaic projects that you work on. The tree I'll be using in today's video is this white one right here that, quite frankly, I'm not exactly sure what it's made from. It's not wood, although they tried to make it look like painted wood. I know this because on the bottom I can see where they've glued two molded pieces together. So it's some sort of man-made plastic material. Other suitable materials that you could use include glass, ceramic, metal, wood, and cement. And yes, even though a tree substrate might have some texture to it, like mine here, you can still use it for mosaic. Now obviously I'm working on a 3D substrate. This one is tiered, and as you can see there are 4 tiers, but you might like one where there's no tiers, or it's just a single surface. Or you might decide on a substrate that's small or big-ish. Whatever substrate you pick, you can use and apply the steps and methods that I'm going to show you today. Be sure to check out the description down below because I'm going to list a few more tree substrates that caught my eye while I was shopping for the one I ultimately decided on. The tiling style for this winter tree will involve some planning. In order to create the mosaic I have in mind, I need to create a pattern for how I'll cut the tesserae. So to get started, I'll take a ruler and measure the length of the bottom tier. As you can see on my substrate, each tier curves down to meet the top of the next tier. So I'm only measuring the flat surface area of the tier and not the curved part. And then I take the measurement and draw it on a piece of copy paper. So this is how long my test array will be, but I'm still not sure how wide it should be. So I make a guesstimate and cut out a piece of paper. First, I hold that piece of paper up to the substrate to see if I got the length right. And it appears I need to make it a little shorter, so I adjust the pattern. The next step in creating a pattern is that I don't want the tesserae to stick out from the substrate. It's a round substrate, but I'll be adhering strips of flat tesserae to it. So I'm holding the pattern up to the substrate to see if I need to make any adjustments to the width of the pattern, and it looks like I do. I'm also cutting the pattern at a slight angle so that one end is a little tapered. The tapered ends of the tesserae will be adhered to the top of each tier. It's a very subtle tapering. And I label the pattern so I know it's for the bottom tier. Once I'm happy with that pattern, I move on and go through the same exact steps for each of the remaining 3 tiers. Now that I have 4 patterns for the tiers, I'm ready to get started with tesserae selection. I'm using stained glass in different shades of green for this tree. So I'll get started going through my glass stash, first looking at scrap pieces to see if any of the patterns will fit. I'm looking for dark and light shades of green. I want a variety on this mosaic. So I get started with tracing the pattern onto the glass and then cutting it. I used a glass cutter and running pliers as well as my wheeled glass nippers to get this done. To trace the pattern onto the glass, I used permanent markers in black for the lighter shades of stained glass and metallic copper for the darker shades. I tried to maximize the scrap glass I had so I would move the patterns around to see which tier sizes would give me the most tesserae. But having said that, I also tried to make sure that I had at least 1 tessera of each color I used on each tier. Does that make sense? So in other words, if I used lime green glass, I made sure each tier had at least 1 tessera of that exact shade of lime green. And I just kept going through the glass stash and measuring, tracing, scoring, and cutting out the stained glass. If you're curious how to cut stained glass or you want to know what tools I prefer to use, I'll include a link to a playlist down below in the description. I should also mention here that not all of these tesserae are cut exact. They're not all uniform. There is definitely a little wiggle room. And at this point, you might be thinking, how much glass do you need to cut? Well, I wasn't sure exactly how much I needed. I didn't get into the math of it. I just cut until it looked like I had enough. And later in the video, you'll see that I was spot on for a few of the tiers, but trust me, that was just luck. If you don't want to use stained glass and you'd rather use something else, that's perfectly fine. You can probably skip this pattern making step and move on to the tiling. By far, the tracing and cutting of the stained glass took the longest of any of the steps in this project. Okay, oh my gosh, take a look at this. You see what I mean about maximizing a piece of stained glass. I have 1 piece of this gorgeous lime green swirled glass, and I made sure that I could fit at least 1 tessera in each of the tier pattern sizes on it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have used it. So I traced the patterns on there and I carefully scored each one and then carefully cut them out. And then once I was done cutting everything out, I used a glass grinder to smooth the edges of all the tesserae. You can also use a grinding stone, and I'll include glass grinder and grinding stone options for you down in the description. And then I cleaned up the tesserae to get them ready for tiling. So here they are, all smooth and clean, and yes, keeping them grouped together by tiers on these little project trays was key in how quickly the tiling went. You'll see what I mean in a minute. I'll include a list down below in the description for all of the tesserae tools, adhesives, grout, and substrate that I used in today's video in case you'd like to make a winner tree of your own. Before I start tiling, I need to decide on an adhesive. But let me show you what's going on with my substrate first compared to the tesserae, because this will be one of the things that helps me make a decision on which adhesive to use. As you can see here, my substrate isn't actually straight. There's a slight curvature to it. So my flat stained glass isn't actually touching the substrate in the middle. It does at either end, but I want it to touch entirely. So I decided on white thinset as the adhesive, and I'll give you a bunch of reasons why in a minute, but let's get started tiling and then we'll circle back to some of the other adhesive options. So I ended up buttering each tessera. This means that I applied the adhesive directly to the back of the tesserae. I used a wood craft stick to do this, or you can use a mini spatula or a palette knife. Doing this allowed me to control how much adhesive is on the back of the tessera. And in doing this, I made sure the entire back of the tessera was coming in contact in some way with the substrate. Now, these tesserae are heavy, so to speak, so when one starts moving downward, it's gonna pull the surrounding friends with it. I mean, why should one of them only be having fun when all of them could be having fun? So to keep them in place while the adhesive firms up and dries a little bit, I'm using small pieces of painter's tape to tape the tops of the stained glass to the curved, untiled area of the tier above it. If you do this, make sure your painter's tape doesn't come in contact with the thinset. You don't want to adhere your tape to your substrate. Just keep it clear of that and focus on sticking it to the surface of the stained glass. If you'd rather tile your mosaic by laying the substrate on its side and then tiling in sections, you certainly can. It's just going to take you longer to complete the tiling portion of this project. But I wanted to tile this tree in one tiling session, so the painter's tape came in clutch. As I continue to tile, let's go back to the discussion we were having earlier about possible adhesives for this project. So in cases like this substrate here, where there's a little curve but my tesserae is flat, then I need an adhesive that will allow for what's called build-up or setup. In other words, an adhesive like Weilbacher isn't going to cut it. I'm working on a vertical surface, so I need an adhesive that will work with me because, yeah, gravity. I'm talking about adhesives like thinset, epoxy sculpt, and possibly even silicone. To be totally honest, the best adhesive in my opinion for this type of project is probably going to be epoxy sculpt because of its holding power in a situation exactly like this. But instead, as I mentioned earlier, I decided to use white thinset. And in case you aren't familiar, thinset is a cement-based adhesive. So why did I pick thinset instead of epoxy sculpt or silicone? For one, I don't have white epoxy sculpt. All I have is dark gray. And I needed an adhesive that was specifically white, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And as far as silicone goes, I only have clear. So here's why I think white thinset is the way to go for the tesserae I'm using. Not only will the white thinset set up or allow me to build up my tesserae on the substrate, and allow for a super firm hold, but it will also enhance the tesserae I'm using. Let me explain. I chose the white variety of thinset because some of the tesserae I'm using is light colored or semi-transparent, and I didn't want gray thinset or gray adhesive to show through or dull it down. So that goes for my gray epoxy sculpt as well. It would have dulled my tesserae, or at least some of my tesserae. The white thinset will either brighten or keep those lighter colors of stained glass as close to their natural color as possible. The top of my tree looks like a jumbled painter's tape mess, but I assure you they're all working together to stay up on that tier. Talk about teamwork. I'll include a list down below in the description for the tools, tesserae, adhesives, grout, and of course substrate that I'm using in today's video in case you'd like to make a winter tree of your own. Okay, the tree has been sitting here for at least 24 hours, or more like 5 days due to my studio schedule, so it's fully dry. The first thing I need to do is remove all of the painter's tape. And I'll remove each piece carefully and hopefully nothing is attached to the thinset. I'm taking my time with this because I don't want to accidentally pull off a tessera. Not that I think it could happen because the holding power of thinset and the amount of adhesive that I use behind each piece of stained glass was pretty, not a lot, but I mean, it was enough. But still, it's better to go carefully and slowly. And just as I'm taking off the painter's tape, I'm actually going to put some back on. Wait, what? Yeah. I want to keep certain areas free from grout, so I'll use painter's tape again to take care of this. The first area I want to cover is the opening on the bottom of the substrate. Now, it's not like this is a piggy bank and I've got to keep that area totally free of grout, but I don't want any grout getting in there. And honestly, I'm not sure yet how I'm going to finish off the bottom, so I want it to be free of the scratchy grout in case I decide not to do anything with it. I wouldn't want scratchy grout to be sitting on top of my furniture that could possibly get damaged. And the next areas I'm going to tape up are the areas below the stained glass on each tier. Because it's such a tight spot on my substrate, I'm going to use smaller pieces or strips of painter's tape in order to not cover the tiled area that I do want grouted. By taping off this area, I can ensure that the bulk of the grout will stay off of it. And it'll also create a nice hard grout line in the joint areas at the bottom of each piece of stained glass. If a little grout gets on there, it's easy to wipe off. But I want the white wood or whatever this tree is made of to be exposed. So in other words, I only want grout to be on the areas where there's stained glass. Now that the tree is prepped, I'm going to get started with mixing up my grout. I want to use white grout to simulate snow, but in my opinion, white grout might look kinda boring, especially in areas where there's more of a grout line between the tesserae. So I'm going to mix something into my grout to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit, and that something is glitter for grout. This will give it a little subtle sparkle as people move around it. You can add a little or a lot of glitter to your grout. It's personal preference. If you aren't sure how to mix up grout, or you're interested in coloring or tinting your grout, or maybe you'd like to learn why you shouldn't use regular glitter in your grout, I'll include a link to a playlist down below in the description. Okay, the grout has been sitting here for a few minutes and now I'll get started. I start by getting a little bit of grout in my hand and apply it to the tree. Now, it doesn't really matter where you start. I'm just starting at the top of the tree due to gravity. But again, it doesn't matter what part of the tree you start on first. And I get started with pushing the grout into the grout line in a clockwise counterclockwise motion, making sure the grout is firmly packed into each joint. I'm making sure that I'm getting grout into each area between the stained glass from top to bottom. Because I cut the stained glass just shorter than the length of each tier of the tree, I don't have to worry about it trailing off the substrate, which can sometimes create sharp points or edges. But I still want to make sure that I create a nice grout line that runs the entire length of the stained glass to meet up with the corners of the glass. So basically I want to cover them so they aren't sharp anymore and cause a potential hazard for anyone who might want to pick up the tree. And then once I'm done grouting, I'll let it sit here for 10 to 15 minutes before I proceed. Okay, the tree has been sitting here drying and is now ready to be cleaned off. I'll remove the grout in the same way as I put it on, which is rubbing the surface in a clockwise counterclockwise motion. You want to expose all of the surface area of your tesserae. Be careful not to rub the grout line so much that you pull grout out. You don't want to do that. You want your grout to be at the same surface level as the stained glass. Take your time with this process so that you don't pull out the grout, but also so you don't knock off any tesserae. When I'm done cleaning out the grout, I like to run an old paintbrush or chip brush over the surface of the tree to remove any loose particles of dust. And then once that's done, the next step is to remove the painter's tape very carefully. Should some grout come off with the painter's tape, just go back in and re-grout the area. Once all of the painter's tape is off, I like to carefully dust the surface again with a chip brush. You can use a damp paper towel or sponge and go over the surface of your mosaic, including the areas that were taped off. This will also help to get rid of any grout particles or dust, plus it reduces the possibility of a grout haze developing later. I'll include a list down below in the description for all of the tools and tesserae and substrate and adhesive and grout that I used in today's video in case you'd like to make a winter tree of your own. All right, are we ready? Because this is gonna be a long video. Come on, girl, you got this, come on. I'll include a list down below in the, nope, I told you this was a long video. For more mosaic inspiration, check out one of these two videos. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon. Bye!